My name is Sri Chalapa. I'm the co-founder and president of Engagedly, and welcome to our web series of People Plus Strategy Insights. And today I'm joined with Kristen Donnelly and Erin Hinson. Just a quick background about them. Abbey Research exists to empower inclusive communities to cultivate and activate their empathy. Empathy is an intellectual posture, not an emotional response, and they believe it is powered by curiosity and it's mandatory to change the world. They have an active YouTube channel, a thrice weekly podcast, and travel around the world giving trainings and keynotes to help organizations in their expanded empathy. So today we're going to talk about the inevitable that many managers have to do as they become managers and they have to let somebody go, commonly known as firing somebody. So today we're really going to talk about, with the good doctors of Abbey Research on how to really go about this process. So there is empathy to the employee, because it is very traumatic experience, especially if you haven't gone through that once before yourself. And even if you have, it's still never easy.
Thank you so much, Sri, and thank you for having us with Engagedly. We're delighted to be here. I know it said in our bio, we travel the world, but we are also on Zoom, clearly. So I think our common refrain is, have laptop, will travel, but also when we have internet, we're happy to join people. Thank you for joining us, those of you that are joining us live. Those of you watching on the replay, hello. We have a very active replay crew on our YouTube channel, so we know people can't always make these events. And so however you are joining us, either in person, live, or on replay, we're delighted that you're here. As Sri mentioned, I'm Dr. Erin Hinson. My colleague, Dr. Kristen Donnelly, is joining us today for how to fire people empathetically, which one of my favorite things to do when I make the PowerPoints for our talks is find stock photos. And when I was trying to find one where it looked like it might be an empathetic firing, spoiler alert, there aren't any stock photos. And this young woman here clearly has not had a good experience leaving her position. So that's, I think, where we will start, and we will move towards empathy as we often do. Before we get in to the nuts and bolts of why we're here, I want to start by checking in and maybe naming some of the feelings that you're having thinking about having to fire people, or maybe you've had these feelings in the past. So, are you tired of having contentious firings and ending relationships badly with the people that are no longer a fit for your organization? Do you get anxious when you think about firing someone or having to have a disciplinary talk? Dr. Kristen and I both get anxious about lots of things, but one of the ones that we feel we can relieve some of the anxiety in is in this situation of having to fire someone. Is hiring and firing employees a stressful part of your job? I don't know anyone in the world who would say no, I love it. It's so easy. It's an absolute breeze. So if you are, vibing with any of these feelings, if you're answering these questions, yes, and yes, you're in the right spot, and we are here to help. So today we're going to be sharing with you the 3 things you need to know in order to fire people empathetically. You have to know your culture, you have to know your people, and you have to have clear communication. So those are the 3 things we're going to be sharing with you to help you develop a practice of empathy in your organization to make any potential firings an empathetic one. So as Sri said, we call ourselves the good doctors. That is because we both have PhDs in social science, but we view ourselves as empathy educators. And empathy really is the way forward to understanding yourself better and understanding others and the world around you better. And if we start first with empathy, we can do a lot of things better. And that's basically our model of business. We are fierce advocates for inclusivity and curiosity, and we believe this can help us go from misunderstanding and disconnection and frustration and anger and disappointment to cooperation and cohesion and real inclusivity, which I think we would like to see a lot more of in the world. We are best friends and business partners. We met over 10 years ago now. Whew, it took me a while to like say 10 years ago, and now it's like over 10 years. In 2001, while we were studying abroad in Northern Ireland, which is where we both got our PhDs, and we joined forces with Abbey Research. Dr. Kristen started it in 2015. I joined in 2017, and we have been through many iterations of who we are and what we can do to serve folks. But Empathy Educators is where we feel the most confident and secure and energized about where we're going. So that is us. And now we'd like to start off with a quick poll. We would love to know, have you ever been fired, or have you ever had to fire someone?
Strangely emotional question sometimes, because you hit like, oh, I've had to fire somebody, and all of a sudden like that feeling comes back and everything else. It's rough. It's rough.
Yeah. And I think whether or not you've been fired can certainly then change the way you approach if you then advance into a managerial or a leadership position. Hopefully we learn from the times in our lives that maybe we've been fired or let go from places. And we certainly will talk through some of the ways in which you can learn from those experiences with empathy and understanding folks.
What we'd love now, if you wouldn't mind, is hopping in the chat and telling us about the worst firing experience that you've had. Either that you've received it, you've been fired, or you are you just absolutely botched the firing process as the firer. I have both stories, and I'm sure that a lot of people do too. So we'd love for you to tell us what's going on. Obviously, a long drawn out thing might feel a little bit overwhelming. So, just give us some details and let us know what's going on. Most of the folks around here have not been fired themselves, but they have had to fire somebody. So that's really interesting. And I really hope that we can maybe unpack some of the emotions around that answer. If you've never had to fire somebody, if you've never been fired, one of the first things we're going to ask you to do is kind of imagine what it would feel like to be fired. And that's going to be a key step towards things. So one of the craziest firing experiences that I ever had as a human, like being fired, was I was working at a church, which religious organizations sometimes are the worst at this, by the way. You would think they'd be the best, but they're the worst. And I got pulled into an office, wasn't told ahead of time what it was about, got told that I was damaging and harmful. Those are words that they used in a firing scenario. And then told that they had been keeping evidence against me for like a year, and I wasn't allowed to see that evidence or to refute it. So obviously, from if I knew my legal rights or anything else like that, I wasn't a legal employee, so I couldn't have done anything. But it's fine. Sometimes as employers, we do have to keep evidence. We do have to make a track record, but keeping it for a year and never talking to somebody is not okay. And not letting them see it or respond to it is not okay. It's not the best way to move forward in terms of dignifying the response of the human. I was highly traumatized by this process, as you can imagine. It actually made its way into one of my TED Talks because it's so foundational to how I see things. And we'll get into a little bit more about some of the times that I've had to actually fire people as not only am I one of the good doctors at Abbey Research, I'm the COO of our parent company, which is a multinational network of companies. And so I've had to fire people in multiple states. And I get that joy in multiple locations. So we'll be sure to do that.
Right. I was just thinking as you were talking, we talk about jobs as they are a part of our story, as who we are. We all talk about past work experiences and how we get to know people a lot is through the stories we tell from our work experiences. And it's such a foundational part to how we see ourselves. And sometimes if those experiences end poorly and end badly, it can really change us as people. To understand that we've all been in these positions, whether it's you were fired from your job at Dairy Queen when you were 16 because you were a 16-year-old kid and you slept in too many times, or you had a traumatic experience like Dr. Kristen. These are actually experiences that can help bring us together and can help us better understand humans in a way that means we can, when we have to do these really hard conversations, we can do it with empathy.
I have left a lot of jobs, and I wasn't fired really before that one. But I've also left jobs where the leaving wasn't great. Like my contract ended, but if the contract hadn't ended, if the contract wasn't ending, we would have had to have some hard conversations. Like employment is always messy in a lot of ways. And so kind of keeping that in mind as we move forward, perhaps as many of you on this call have never been fired, but maybe you've had a really weird parting of ways. Maybe there was a supervisor who left and like, oh, thank God. Like maybe there's some stuff that makes employment messy for you that you can draw on memories of as we move forward from here. If not, totally cool. And I'd love to talk to you afterwards to discover how you've avoided this. And we can figure out what we can learn from you, because obviously it's a lot. So I think we'll move on and we'll do another really quick poll. So what I'd love to know now is what you think about empathy, because we're going to move into this word that Shri used to describe us, that we use to describe ourselves. Do you think that empathy is about feelings? Do you think empathy is about being sensitive? Do you think empathy is about making people feel comfortable, or do you think it's something else? Well, we'll let you guys know that it is a little bit more complicated than it's ever been presented before. So it is somewhat about making folks feel comfortable sometimes. Sometimes it is about feeling or being sensitive. But really more often than not, it's a lot broader and wider than we ever think it is. So empathy is not actually, believe it or not, about understanding or feeling the same emotions as other people. I'm a trained social worker. I've been in, various degrees of HR in a lot of different organizations. And I remember the number one things in like so many counseling and like, mental sensitivity trainings or things like that is that we tell people, look at your colleague and say, I know just how you feel. And whenever someone says that to me, my immediate response is, no, you don't. No, you don't. And it's been that way for most of my life. And for a long time, I thought I was just contrary and a little bit grumpy. And then as I got older and I had more training in social sciences, I started to unpack what that phrase really meant. And what I realized is that none of us actually know how someone else feels, because very rarely we don't know how we feel, to be completely honest. Feelings are overlapping emotions. The more emotions research that we do, the more we learn that like feelings are weird, and it's like trying to nail Jell-O to a tree to say exactly what you feel. The example that Dr. Aaron and I share all the time is that we both lost our paternal grandmothers within about 6 months of each other. And so if we have been at this point best friends for almost 5 years at that point. I mean, it had been a while, like we knew each other. And yet our relationships with our grandmothers were so different. And our relationships with our fathers are different. And our fathers' relationships with their mothers are different. All of this, their deaths were different. My grandmother died from advanced dementia, and it was painful and long. And that is not Aaron's story. So if we can't look at each other and say, I know how you feel, how are strangers supposed to do that? It just it feels to me very rude in a way and unkind to assume that you know how someone feels. So what we would say instead in that situation is, I know your grandmother just died. How are you feeling? And that lets them say, I don't know. I feel a lot of things. I think it's weird. And you can say, do you want to talk about it? And they can say yes or no. So that's a little bit of a different way to open up. The next thing empathy is it's not something that folks are born with and other folks aren't. I actually talked about this yesterday on a podcast. The host said to me, well, empathy is just something we're born with or not, right? And I had to kind of like blow up her spot and be like, actually, it's not. Empathy is a mental posture. It's a worldview. It's a framework. Pick something that makes sense to you. It's something we can all learn. And it's something we all have to learn. Are there people that are born with a better ability to relate to humans than others? Yes. But do those people still have to work at empathy? Absolutely. It's a constant journey. We define it as a consistent, intentional decision to choose understanding. It is a constant kind of thing. People will be like, oh, I'm not touchy-feely. I don't do empathy. I'll be like, okay, well, you're not touchy-feely, totally valid. But you can still do empathy, because empathy is a mental decision to choose understanding over assumptions. So finally, it's not also sensing the emotional states of others. There are highly sensitive people on this planet that can feel kind of how the room is or how someone is. And as we dive into that research and we dive into empathy research, we would contend that what highly sensitive people are feeling is more around energies or like broad emotional categories, like, hey, things feel weird. It's very difficult for even a highly sensitive person to pinpoint the exact emotions of another person. And it's also probably asking way too much of them to do that. So we think the word empath to describe a highly sensitive person is actually a little bit of a misnomer. We would not use the word empath for somebody who has this natural ability. This natural ability is something that you are born with or not. And as we already covered, empathy is something that everybody can work on. So that's kind of something. I am not highly sensitive. Erin is much more sensitive to the energies of other people than I am.
Yes.
The empathy is a worldview that intentionally prioritizes understanding others and how they see and experience the world. Basically, it's remembering that the person in front of you is a person. In terms of employees, they're not the position that they did for you. They're not an interchangeable cog in a profit machine. They're not the toxic thing you have to get rid of. I hate it when people call employees the cancer of the organization. They're not those things. They're human beings. And if we can center humanity, it allows us to ask more questions of the person, of other people, of ourselves, to be honest, too, because the first step of this is empathy towards yourself. And that's another webinar. But we need to ask more questions and make a lot less assumptions. We need to go beyond stereotypes, and we need to learn it not only about different folks, but how folks are different. You know, had the privilege of giving a TED Talk a little bit about this, a little bit about truly the understanding of inclusivity is that everybody gets to show up on their own terms to your organization. Everybody gets to decide who they're going to be. So they're not there as the token Jewish person or the token white person or the token Black person. They're there as a person who also happens to be a lot of things, possibly including like the world's biggest Formula One racing fan, and or somebody who really, really believes in the supremacy of Lucky Charms as the best breakfast cereal. These are all still things that make us who we are. We are all a lot of things all at once, but a lot of our differences are muted at work because we've been told they have to be. And so part of creating an empathetic culture is learning about the things that make your team human, learning about those things beyond them.
Because we have all of these disparate understandings of empathy, that's one of the reasons why all of our trainings start with where we're coming from with empathy, what it means to practice empathy, how we define it, so that when we move into this part, the meat and potatoes of our meal here at this webinar, we have an understanding of where we're all on the same page with what we're talking about empathy being today. So now let's jump into the 3 things you need to fire people empathetically. The first one we mentioned was that you need to know your culture. And so what does it mean when you know your culture? It means that you understand how your ecosystem works within your organization. You know who gets along and who doesn't. You understand the different relationships that are happening within the office, personally and professionally. A lot of times when we get pulled in to clients, a lot of this has to do with people not understanding the culture, or there being several beliefs and understandings about what the culture is that don't vibe with each other. So when you know your culture, it's really important because it means you know the strengths and weaknesses of your team. Really, when it comes down to it, it means you know who to hire and who to fire. And a lot of the problems we're seeing with a lack of empathy in firing people is this lack of broader understanding about what your culture is. And maybe you've gone through a huge shift in how you define your office culture. I mean, the COVID of it all just threw a grenade into so many of our office cultures, the way people work with each other, the way people understand their work and process all the parts of who they are. Whether they're caring for an elderly relative or they had to homeschool their children, all of that means we've all seen massive cultural shifts in our organizations. And so that definition of your culture might have changed. And if you as a leader or manager aren't necessarily aware of how that's changed, you aren't going to know the strengths and weaknesses of your team and how they might have evolved. So one thing that you can do right now to know your culture better is execute a Strengths Finder assessment. You know, there's loads of these assessments out there. There's Myers-Briggs, there's DISC assessment. I was like, I've done all of them. I'm trying to remember which one is which. But for us personally, we really find Strengths Finder to be the most effective, especially for teams in an office environment, because it helps you understand how these people fit together with their various strengths. And there's a lot of excellent data out there in how to understand those strengths and what the numbers mean and how you can put people together. So if you're sitting here thinking like, oh, I might not know my culture, what can I do? We really recommend a Strengths Finder assessment.
And we would recommend too getting somebody who is Strengths Finder certified to help you navigate what that all means in team dynamics, because it can really help. The book and the quiz and everything on the Gallup website are great, but having someone walk through that, and if you are looking for that person, we can tell you who we've worked with and pass that information along. Don't hesitate to get in touch. We promoted somebody a couple of years ago from the quality assurance lab up to be the head of customer service. And we did this entirely based on that we wanted to give her a shot. And the management at the time, I was not a part of this decision. But the thinking was, you know, she'll rise to the occasion. We didn't take into account the culture around her, and we didn't take into account the culture in the lab in which she thrived, which was a lot less leadership decisions, a lot less things like this. And I think we've all done this where you promote somebody because they're good at an existing job. So you want to give them more responsibility and then promote them to a new job. No, she wasn't good at the new job. Like she wasn't fireable. She wasn't terrible, but it turned into so many more headaches because we didn't take time to understand why she thrived where she was thriving. We didn't take the time to make sure we knew what was going on in one department before we moved her to another department, nor did we do the time to understand the culture of the department she was moving to. So we had no idea what we were asking her to do outside of just this very altruistic and lovely idea of she's good at this thing. Let's give her some more responsibility. And I think if we're all honest with ourselves, one of the core roots of a problem in a company of who we need to fire is people that we made that decision about. We promoted them because they were good at one thing, and then we didn't actually promote them. We didn't do them any favors. We were unkind to them as leadership and management and put them not in a position to succeed.
I think Dr. Kristen's example illustrates both the lack of awareness and knowledge of the culture and the person. So you have to know your people. What does it mean when you know your people? It means that you know your folks as individuals, as human beings. You know their potential and their limitations. And it also means that you know the difference between a fireable action and a bad day. So if you don't invest in knowing your people and knowing what motivates them, knowing their strengths and weaknesses, how they fit in with a team, what's going on at home that might be causing them a lot of stress, then you aren't going to be able to have a nuanced understanding of what is really just being stressed or possibly being put in the wrong position within your culture, or what is actually an action that means they are no longer a good fit in your organization. And knowing your people is really important because people reach their potential when they feel valued and they feel known. We do a lot of generational work in a research institute that we run in Charleston, South Carolina. And this is one of the biggest things we hear from Gen Z entering the workforce. They want to go to places where they are valued, where they contribute positively. And so, no one wants to be a cog in a machine. Nobody wants to feel that they are a cog in a machine. And if they feel that their leadership isn't taking the time to see them as a human person, or as a human being, not a human doing, we say very frequently, then you're going to get a lot of interpersonal issues. You're going to get disconnection. You're going to get a lot of the problems that we have identified crop up when you don't have a focus on building an empathetic culture. One thing you can do now to know your people better is to plan an activity where people are humans and not workers, and where they can decide what part they are bringing of themselves that maybe isn't a part they've brought to work before. This is so important because, you know, as a part of people seeing themselves as valued and known, they want to be seen beyond their productivity. They want to be seen beyond the tasks that they complete for you or don't complete for you. And so, you know, you can run an office poll and find out what kind of hobbies people have on the weekend. And if you get, you know, 3 people that love axe throwing, maybe go to an axe throwing event and, you know, networking place. I couldn't find any stock photos of axe throwing that wasn't like not the networking kind of axe throwing. So I went with bowling because we're not
promoting everybody become Visigoths, in case anyone was wondering. Like, that's not the vibe we're going for here.
The stock photos were a little too aggressive. So we haven't quite caught up on stock photos in terms of understanding the power of axe throwing as a networking event. But as we travel the world and the country doing our work, we see those axe throwing places everywhere.
Yeah. So for example, one of the things that our parent company does is that there's a Thanksgiving potluck every year, where management actually does none of it. The employees plan all of it. They bring in meals from their own cultures that mean Thanksgiving to them. Like, that's one of the things that's done. But what an example I'd love to share about knowing your people is more of a disciplinary conversation that we have at our parent company at Abbey. One of the side effects of knowing your people and individuals is that you can pull them aside and say, hey, here's the pattern of lateness. Like, what's going on? And what is something going on? Are you having trouble dropping your kids off in the morning? Are you having trouble doing this? And we had one employee that had been, you know, one of those problem children for years. A temper issue, you know, we kept moving them in different departments because they couldn't get along with people. But there was just something in us that said, like, it's not bad enough to fire, and they need a job and kind of all that. And it fit with our particular thing. And finally, we were at the end of our rope. We had sat down and worked with this person as hard as we could. And we were at the point where it was like, okay, I don't know what to do anymore. And so I just looked at them and I said, here's the pattern of behavior over the last couple months. And what this says to me is that you don't want to work here. I don't know if that's what you mean, but this is what it's communicating to me. So as far as I'm concerned, if these things keep happening, you are choosing not to work here anymore. And we can decide what parting ways looks like. If these behaviors change, you are telling me you want to work here. The choice is entirely in your hands. And something else we've learned about people is that when you put the choice in their power, it removes a lot. It does empower them, as cheesy as that sounds. But it's the same thing of like with students, where like a teacher didn't give you an A, you earned one. In other news, completely different changed behavior. Employee is still with us 6 years later, just bought their very first house, because all I did was say, this isn't a punishment conversation. This is a choice conversation. And I knew that that's what they needed to hear. And it's completely turned around.
The third thing you need to be able to fire people empathetically and build a culture of empathy in your organization, it's the wonder of clear communication. So when you have clear communication in your office, that means that everyone actually understands company communications. You do everything within your power to make sure that happens. We say this all the time in our trainings. Obviously, there are things as leaders and managers that you can't share. Transparency does not mean showing them your diary and everything you've ever experienced or everything that's going on with the organization. But it does mean being as honest as you can, and being honest when you can't tell them things too. I think it's so important to be able to say, you know what, this is not something I can really share, but we're having conversations around maybe changing the HR platform that we use. I can't tell you more right now, but I want you to be aware that this is happening in case you hear something, so that we're all on the same page. So, clear communication seems like a simple step, but it really can be very complicated. It's super important because clear communication is kind communication. And Dr. Kristen shared that with her example with their employee. She was being kind to that human being in front of her by saying, look, something's not working here. Talk to me about what it is. Can we find a way forward? Or is this where we part ways? When people know what is happening, when people are treated like human beings and not human doings, they feel safe and they feel valued. And it's going to lead to a lot stronger relationships going forward. One of the things that you can do right now, if you feel like clear communication might be something that your organization is struggling with, is evaluate and adjust your corporate lexicon and dictionary. This is one of the things we do really early on when we're brought in to help clients with cultural issues and building an empathetic culture. And a lot of times we find that if there are problems in communication, it's because there has not been clearly articulated meaning of what is a team, what is, what are the corporate mission statements and goals? Are you practicing those in a way that is clear to the folks that you are leading and managing? Those are all questions you can ask, and it's a great place to start, because if you're going to find dysfunction, you'll find it with the language real quick.
Yeah, or like maybe you were like my company a couple years ago, and all of a sudden you had to put out all of this COVID protocols, and it didn't
Anybody have
occur
any
to you.
experience with that? No.
Didn't maybe occur to you that half of your workforce prefers to speak Spanish? And so we did this thing where we put out, like, we thought we were super clear. Like, we translated into layman's terms everything the CDC was saying. If you test, if you're this, if you're this, if you're this. And in October of 2020, we had our first person come to work with COVID, and we were livid. Like, they had done a scene and understood. Like, we have a signature on a piece of paper, and we were all ready, my brother and I, to like get really salty. And then finally, one of our supervisors said, it's possible he didn't understand what you meant. And we're like, what do you mean? Like, we were getting very defensive. And our supervisor very gently and very firmly said, I don't actually know his comprehension in English. And it was like the entire, like, we just felt 3 feet tall. My brother and I were like, oh, why didn't we think of having any of these things in Spanish? This is on us. We are so sorry. And because of our mistake, we put our folks at risk. Now, thankfully, he had very mild COVID, full recovery. Nobody else in our factory caught it. Everybody was fine. But like, my brother and I had to take a real hard look at our policy of translating things, because a lot of our policies had been written before our workforce shifted. And now a lot of our workforce would prefer to be communicated with in Spanish, especially about healthcare issues. And it's not that they don't speak English, it's that there's a better comprehension and ability to apply it in Spanish. So why can't we do the kind thing, spend the extra $100 to get someone to translate the CDC documents? Okay. And then as soon as the CDC caught up, they had it in Spanish. So we just downloaded it in Spanish. We had to remember to do that. So that's a really don't be us, learn from our mistakes. And the clear communication is kind communication is so important, especially these days, as all the communication for a lot of people is happening over type. So remember, tones of voice aren't communicated over type. We've all had this crash course in remote working. It's not going away. Remote working isn't going away. And so being really aware of how you communicate is a really important step forward to building an empathetic culture that allows you to fire people with empathy.
One thing I've noticed, even in our organization, in my experience in the past, is that most managers are fearful of communicating something that is a criticism in some ways, or what I would call a feedback or a feed forward, right? Because they're afraid of confrontation, or maybe some resistance from the employee. So you're actually doing both of yourself and the employee disservice by not doing that. We had a webinar last couple of weeks ago on giving real-time coaching feedback. And that, I think, is very important as you're doing this communication, because if you're giving real-time coaching feedback, you're really helping the employee do better work. You're opening up the communication, so the employee knows how you feel about their work and the outcomes that they're seeing. But ultimately, the organization also benefits, right? And if it doesn't work, like you said, the communication that you mentioned earlier, Kristen, about this employee, where you gave the employee the choice, that's exactly that. But most managers struggle with that. At least the first time managers struggle with that. I think that's the key takeaway I would say from your points here is that, if you're a manager, you got to step up, and that's part of your job. It's not a footnote. It's part of your job.
And something that we would recommend, for instance, for disciplinary conversations, not these coaching ones. So if anyone on this call is really nervous about disciplinary stuff, I get it. Disciplinary is hard, even before the firing. Posture yourself in that you need to hear their side of the story. So begin the conversation with, hey, can you tell me about what happened here? Can you tell me that? And every single time I've done that, and people on our team have done that, we have learned things we didn't know.
Yeah.
We learned motivations, we learned assumptions, and then it became a conversation not about disciplinary measures, but instead about getting to the root of what's going on, changing some things so that never happens again. Does it still mean that I discipline folks? Oh, for sure. Like, we've done formal write-ups after that, but we start the process with tell me what's going on.
Yeah. Which is
and
so
that
important.
has helped. Just that subtle shift has helped anxieties quite a bit.
Empathy is about asking more questions and making less assumptions. And if you start any sort of disciplinary conversation by making an assumption about what the motivation was, what the action was, what the problem was, if you're dealing with like an interpersonal conflict, you're really closing off the ability to help solve the problem. And the problem might not be solvable. That is a thing that happens to all of us. That's why we're here, is because we're talking about sometimes you just have to fire people. But how do you do it empathetically? You start by asking those questions and not assuming that everything that has happened in a particular situation. So speaking of how you can understand the level of empathy in your culture, we're going to drop into the chat here the link to our opt-in, which is a test for testing the level of empathy in your culture. So we've given you all these ideas and a couple of tips about firing people empathetically. But really, in order to fire people empathetically, you need to have a culture of empathy. And so we have to start from, do we have a culture of empathy or not? And where do we go from here?
So what we'd love for you to do is take away these questions and think about them. So what would look different in your organization if you implemented even one of our tips? What one thing are you taking away? And grab a scratch piece of paper and scribble it down for yourself and think about what could shape a little bit differently. What if you did disciplinary conversations by opening up with tell me what happened? What if you put the power of hiring or firing to a certain extent back into your employees' hands, like I did? Here's the standard. Here's what we say has to happen for you to be here. Here's what you're doing. So what you're communicating to me is that you don't want to be here. What do we do? And how does that happen? And make it a collaborative conversation. Maybe that's your takeaway. Maybe you're going to hang out in Strengths Finders.
One of the big stories that made around on the social media a few months ago was the mass firing at better.com. Are you guys familiar with that?
I missed that one.
But the CEO basically fired everybody over Zoom. Not everybody, 800 people over Zoom. And then he basically said, if you are on the Zoom call, it's because you're getting fired, basically. I'm paraphrasing.
Oh, no, I did hear about that. I didn't know what the company name was. Yeah, we heard about that. Yeah.
It was better.com. And it was a big issue. And then the CEO had to go on a sabbatical, but he's back.
Had to go. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, exactly. So
right.
I guess my question really is around, if you had to, first of all, is that acceptable at all? The answer is obviously no, but what exactly should they have done instead? The second thing is, in the Zoom culture and the culture of being asynchronous mode of communication that we are in a lot, one of the things I'm very favorable of is actually having a conversation when you're letting somebody go and not just send them a text, you do a breakup over text or email. So maybe can you talk to the audience about those two areas and how to actually have the conversation in an environment that we are in today?
It's going to look different for every one of your employees. Yeah. So some of your employees, you're going to know that saying, hey, can we schedule a meeting? We need to talk is going to send them to an anxiety spiral. And so you kind of, figure out what to do. It is never appropriate to end someone's employment over a text message. It is never appropriate to end someone's employment without a conversation, ever.
It's never appropriate to end someone's contract or to terminate them en masse.
No.
like in front of other people. That is the very definition of how to not fire, of how to fire people without empathy. Goodness.
Hear me too, as a manager, and you, a lot of you guys know this, it's hard. Firing people is hard. But like Shri said, this is hard conversations are part of your job.
Yeah.
You can do hard things and you're getting paid to do hard things. And if you really are terrified and don't know what to do, unless you're the owner of the company, there's somebody above you that can help you strategize this and plan it out. There are resources. Engagedly is one of them. Resources where people can really help you figure out how to kindly and clearly have these difficult conversations. Because at the end of the day, everyone's a human.
Yeah.
And what that CEO did, who should not still have his job, because I think he has demonstrated he is not into leadership in a real way. He might be into control or power, but that's not leadership. What that person did was fire a bunch of numbers on a spreadsheet. He hit delete on a spreadsheet. He didn't reshape his team. He didn't remember that they were people. And so any behavior that centers people as people is going to be innately healthier for everybody than a behavior that centers people as numbers on a spreadsheet.
And that doesn't mean that, that you don't fire people. That doesn't mean that relationships are salvageable. One of our phrases about empathy that we use all the time, understanding somebody is not agreeing with them. It is not condoning their actions. It is not making exceptions if they violated company policy. That is not empathy. And that is what it means to fire people empathetically. If you have to fire them, you treat them like a human being. If they violated the company policy, if they broke the rules, if they caused irreparable damage, then they get fired. But you can fire them as a human being and not as a cog that broke the machine.
There's another example on the opposite side. This is somebody I'm connected with on LinkedIn, where a CEO basically got on LinkedIn, said we had to let a bunch of people go in our company because we lost a big contract, one of the bigger contracts, and we had to let them go. And he was really apologetic, but he had no other option. And he asked people, other recruiters, to please let him know if they're looking for people, because they have they have really good deep talent that would be very valuable somewhere else.
Yeah.
To me, that's a classic case of empathy and being supportive in the whole process. Right?
The world is real. Like, we got to keep the lights on. And if you can't make payroll, you can't make payroll. Like, that's part of this. In a lot of industries, that's the gig. But being fired should not be a judgment on your moral character, the way it often is, and the way that people are often made to feel. So as we kind of move towards the end of this, we want to thank you so much for your time with us today, whether it is live here on the 27th of April or you're in our beloved replay crew. I promise that companies can work this way. I promise. I've worked in one. I'm in the second generation ownership of one. We've been doing business this way for 32 years. And we've learned a lot. And one of the things that we've learned is that if you treat people like people, they'll treat you like one too. If you build a culture of trust and respect where you are open for conversation, negotiation, if discipline isn't a scary word, if accountability is something that everybody is held to, that kind of company culture is a place where people thrive, and where firings are inevitable conclusions of a conversation that has already been happening. Except for a sudden financial layoff because of a lost contract, behavioral firings should never come as a surprise. The kind thing to do, as we've been saying, is to walk people along their journey and give them choices and power along the way. It can look like this. And I believe in my heart that if you're hearing this and you're listening to this, you want it to look like this. And so our hope for you is that as managers and as employees, that you are at a place that centers and values your humanity, that understands that you don't leave who you are at the door when you show up for work, that if you're stressed about your kids, you're stressed about your kids. If you're caregiving for an elderly parent, that's happening. If you're having a medical crisis or you had there was an accident on the way to work and you're grumpy, all of these things mean that you get to be a human person at your employment. And our deep hope for you always is that your humanity is centered and celebrated and not seen as a liability.
We would love to support you going forward. If this is an area that you feel like you could use some help with, empathy is hard work. It is practice every day. There are days you're not going to be good at it, and that's okay because you're a human. There are days that we're not good at it, and we're empathy educators as a profession, but it is something that is necessary. And so we hope we've shown you how it's necessary and why it's needed in your organization. If we can help you with this, we would be only so delighted to do so. So we know that this can feel overwhelming, especially in these times as we're all still navigating what it means to work and live in the midst of an evolving global pandemic. Everybody is stressed, everybody is tired, everybody is overwhelmed, just as a baseline, never mind all the other things of who we are that we bring to work every day. So we hope you will book a call with us if we can be of help, and we're going to drop a direct link to a call with Dr. Kristen and I for this webinar. So save it, click on it, schedule it sometime. If you have more questions, if you think we might be able to serve your organization, we would be only so happy to do so. In the meantime, we would love to thank you all so much for joining us, whether live and in person or sometime on the replay. We will still be empathy educators whenever you are watching this. We will still be hoping that we can serve you in whatever way we can. If you want to follow us on social media and stay in touch about future events, trainings that we offer, we've got a couple more coming up this year that we would love to have you at. So we're on all the socials except TikTok because we're elder millennials and that it scares us. Although Dr. Kristen is on TikTok, but I can't handle too many socials. So these are the ones we can manage, and these are the ones you will find us on. So we hope that you reach out, and we hope to hear from you soon.
Well, thanks a lot, Erin. Thanks, Kristen. I really, really appreciate you coming on here to address this really difficult topic, because we always talk about the happy topics in HR and gloss over the difficult ones. And I wanted to make sure we talked about some difficult topics as well. So the webinar will be hosted on the Engagedly webinars website in about a couple of weeks when it's edited down. But also, if you registered for this, you'll get a notification to watch the replay, which I'm hoping you are. But one positive thing is you're getting a SHRM credit as well. So if you're looking to earn one SHRM credit, we'll send you the code at the within a week. So thank you so much for attending. Thanks again. I really appreciate it. Have a wonderful day.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, Sri.